Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and our continuing series, Sega Racing Renaissance, where we review every single mainline arcade Sega racing game ever released in a retrospective style fashion. And today we have Manx TT Superbike. Now I definitely have mixed feelings on this game because I'm showing you the intro to the Sega Saturn version first, and that is because I actually prefer the Sega Saturn version over the arcade version for many reasons that I will get into just a little bit. But it's an iconic game, it's a famous Sega Saturn game, and of course we are going to talk about it. And jumping right into the game, this is one of the best translations from the arcade to the Sega Saturn that ever existed. I think this is so much better than the original Daytona USA we got at home from Model 2 to Sega Saturn. Now there aren't many courses in the game. Manx TT Superbike is not going to keep you busy for very long, but the time you spend with it is going to be highly entertaining time, and a lot of times I prefer 20 to 30 minutes of solid arcade gameplay to 8 hours of a long console game. It's just the time I have to dedicate, and I grew up with these games, so I love them. But it's fun to get a motorcycle racing game because while we have been showcasing some motorcycles and some 18-wheelers, for the most part Sega went with 4-wheel cars, whether those are trucks or otherwise. But Manx TT Superbike gives you the option to use motorcycles, and in the arcades there was a massive motorcycle cabinet, and that's one of the main reasons I prefer the Sega Saturn version over the arcade version via emulation, is that large motorcycle made the game more controllable versus trying to use a steering wheel or a controller via emulation. Since we're talking about the Saturn version, this is a fast-paced, well-running game that looks graphically very good for the Sega Saturn. It's a pretty big feat to get something like this over from Model 2 to Saturn, because let's switch over to the Model 2 version. Now I have tried every single different ROM, every single different setting I can possibly imagine, and I will tell you right now, I do not know what's going on, but I can never catch up to anybody in the arcade ROM. I'm assuming it's an emulation glitch, but there isn't a Manx TT Superbike cabinet close enough for me to go try, so I'm just going to have to assume that this is an emulation problem, but leave me a comment down below if you know what's going on here, because I am painfully curious. But the biggest issue with the Model 2 version when you are running it on emulation is obviously not having that big motorcycle. No matter how you set the analog controls, no matter what you do with dead zones, no matter what you do with a wheel, you don't have the weight and momentum of a motorcycle, so the game just feels like the turning is way too twitchy. And that's not a knock on the emulation, just the fact that you don't have a giant motorcycle that you can sit on in front of your computer, unless someone really loves this game and has set that up. I'm sure somebody out there probably has, maybe not a viewer, but I imagine that someone has probably tried that at some point in time in this game's history. But that's the other reason why I prefer the Saturn version more than this. It is just more fun to play because it's easier to control. You just end up throwing this bike way too far around the course when you're playing the arcade version. So of course, let's jump back over to the Saturn one, my preferred version. Now you will see immediately it's a definite graphical downgrade, but that is fine because it runs fast and it works. And the control is so much better because the developers at Sega have factored in people playing with a controller, so it just becomes a more fun version of the game to play, even if it's not the prettiest version, because it's just much more controllable. And that's what it really comes down to when you're playing an arcade racing game. If the controls aren't good, then why do you even want to bother in the first place? So if you've never played Manx TT Superbike and you are looking for the better version to play, if you can find an arcade cabinet in the wild, that's going to be the best version. If you cannot, then the Sega Saturn version is going to be the one for you. But even though we only get a few courses, they're very well laid out. I love all the turns, all the different textures, everything going on with the courses in this game. Give you a lot of challenge and a lot of fun, and keep you coming back for more. And you do get more laps off default settings on the Sega Saturn version than you did on the arcade, but you can turn that up. You'll see here, I was able to win the race in first place, and I can do that relatively consistently. On the arcade side, I pretty much get 8th place every single time. But let's move over to the other course in the game. You'll see there are 2 off the main menu, and you do have options for automatic or manual transmission. Basically every standard Sega arcade racing game is going to have the same thing. But again, another great course, but it's got a really spectacular soundtrack as well. It's one of my favorites on the Sega Saturn, so go ahead and listen. I'll come back and tell you more about the game.
Passing the checkpoint! taking the checkpoint!
I would say the musicians at Sega in this generation could do no wrong as far as soundtracks are concerned, but carrying on with this race here in the first lap, I like how long this course is as well. It's just unfortunate the game didn't have a few more courses in any iteration of the game, but then again, this was not uncommon back in the day. Namco, Midway, they all had arcade racing games that only had a few courses, because this game wasn't so much about longevity in arcades, it was about the gigantic motorcycle that you sat on and controlled. But moving over to the arcade version, speaking of that, again, and I don't know why, this is a situation where those bikes immediately take off from me, and I am never going to catch up to them the entire race. Now, I did look at a couple other playthroughs of this game under emulation. It seems like other people have the same problem, so again, if you have any inkling what's going on here, do leave me a comment and let me know, because I would be very curious. But again, it looks better in Model 2. You cannot deny that. Going through this forest section here, all of these trees and the canopies, it just looks better. But if it doesn't control as good as the Sega Saturn version, really what is the point? I wish we could marry the controls of the Saturn version to the emulation of Model 2 on my computer. That's what I'm really looking for here. But this was hyper impressive when it came out. Those buildings have great filtered textures. You rarely if ever see any pixels on screen. Everything looks super smooth. And let me tell you, the first time I saw a Manx TT Superbike cabinet, I 100% had to ask my parents for money to play it, because this was not the type of thing you saw and walked past. There were lines at them, people wanted to play them, and that's because it was such a unique cabinet with that giant motorcycle. It wasn't the first to have something you sat in to drive, but it was Sega, so you knew it was going to be good. And it's interesting that Sega really hasn't come back much to this series or motorcycle racing games in general. Stuff like their modern World Driver Championship is an excellent game, but I wish we'd get a little bit more motorcycle racing from them. Now in real life I don't own a motorcycle whatsoever, I'm not that interested in them, but in the video game world I'm 100% for them. But moving back over to the Saturn version again, you can see the graphical downgrade, but what's most impressive is just how fast this game does continue to run. All those buildings going by in the scenery, all of the other bikes. A lot of times this will cause the Saturn to chug, but the coding, the engineering, the efficiency of Manx TT Superbike on the Saturn does a great job of keeping this game running really smoothly, and that matters so much. A racing game with a bad frame rate is just not one that many people at all are going to want to play. And I owned a Sega Saturn when it released, and when we got ports home from Model 2, a lot of times they were not great. The original Daytona, Virtua Fighter, these were not the most spectacular things ever brought from the arcades to the home console. So when Manx TT Superbike came out and it looked this good and played this good, it's something that you wanted to spend your time and money on, and that's why I love this version. But if you do know of an arcade cabinet for it somewhere in the Chicagoland area, leave me a comment down below, because I genuinely did try to see if there was one around so I could talk to whether or not the difficulty I experienced in emulation is in the arcade cabinet as well, because I turned it to easy and I still cannot get any better than 7th place. So if you know what's going on there, definitely leave me that comment down below. But Manx TT Superbike, spectacular game, and one of the few instances on this series where I'm going to say the home console port's better than the arcade. But short of that, I'll have another racing video next Wednesday, and I'll have videos of the week as well, but that's the time we got. I will see you guys next time. We got 5th. Bye-bye.